Hello everyone. I'd like to talk today about collars, and we're going to work on collars because one of my students is working on, I think, her first project that uses a collar, and I'm a little concerned that she won't have all the information she needs just from the pattern alone. So for the pattern work for today's talk, I don't have her pattern, but I do have this, and I love sharing this with people because it's kind of out of print. But it's from Fashion Services Inc., which was in Minneapolis, and from what I can tell, their trademark expired sometime in the 90s, so I think the company doesn't exist anymore. But you got to love the copy here. The most revolutionary fashion concept since the fig leaf. Timeless, ageless, and fabulous. As you all maybe know, I am quite a sucker for the 1970s as well as the 1770s. So I love this set of patterns, and it also encourages you to think about patterns in a different way than maybe you would if you've only ever encountered modern either PDF or kind of big four patterns. Is that the idea that when you have patterns that are all drafted off a similar block, you can just trade out things like the collars, the sleeves, the pocket styles, and you can kind of become your own designer in that way, even if you don't know how to draft from scratch. So today I'm going to look at the Mandarin or stand-up collar, which is really classic, easy collar, and can also be kind of a basis for a stand collar. And we're going to go from there. Okay, now any pattern work for me always starts at the ironing board with whatever the highest temperature your iron will do without actually making steam. And I just press that right flat. And I really love these patterns because, not just because I'm in love with 1974, although that is a factor, I also love how well they're marked. They tell you what you're matching to. They have a little photo or drawing of what the collar or part of the garment you're doing is. It explains it really well, which I really like. You don't always get that. I like Swedish tracing paper for tracing, but you can really use any method you like. But I do like to do this. Instead of just tracing this piece directly onto this, I'm going to actually take the time to also make a full pattern piece and not just leave the seam here. So that means I just need to do a little bit of marking before I flip it over. So I do like to write. I don't copy every single, like I'm going to say Mandarin collar, but not that it's cut D, but it says cut 4 here. I'm going to say cut 2 layers because I'm converting it from a center back seam to a full pattern piece. I'm going to mark my seam allowance, or mark on my seam allowance, which is nice. It's something else we don't always get with every pattern. And we need an interface. Cut 2 layers fabric plus 2 interface. Now I'm going to decide later if I want to interface both layers of the collar or just one, but I do like to mark that because I'd rather cut more than I need than less than I need. And then the size I'm going to trace is size 16. So here's my center back. And I'm giving myself enough room. One thing they're saying grain here, but there isn't like a grain line per se, but that's because the center back is also the grain line in this particular case, and actually really with any collar. There's 16. And there's a 1/4 inch seam, so I am going to mark where that seam is. So then this, if I chose to cut on the fold, this would be the fold line, and then this is the seam allowance. So I'm just going to leave that marked in there, even though I'm not planning on using it. And I wrote size 16, so I know which one I'm doing. Oh, started to do the wrong one. Not the fastest tracer in the world, but I try to be reasonably accurate. The only thing about tracing paper is you can't always erase very well without tearing it. So now that I've got half of the pattern, there's a couple ways to get the other half. I could just fold the paper along this line when I go to cut it out, and that typically works pretty well. But sometimes I prefer to actually fold it and then flip it over and trace it. But today I am going to show you the folding method, which is a little faster. Now, one thing that made tracing a lot more attractive for me was when I started using a old rotary cutter to cut out my tracings versus using scissors. It's just a lot faster and felt a lot easier too. So I'm just going to start by kind of rough cutting, hopefully a big enough piece to get my whole collar out of. Generous, because it's really irritating to run out of space when you think you've got it. And then I'm just going to fold it very carefully along that line. And then cut it out. Now, I don't use the same blade for this as I do for cutting fabric. I have one for fabric and one for paper, just like you do for scissors. And what I do is, as my fabric rotary blade gets a little dull, I swap it out and toward my hand, which is bad practice. Don't do that, kids. Always cut away from your hand, especially when you're using a dull blade, as I just said I am. And there is my full pattern piece. So I can actually use this piece 3 different ways. I could cut it flat like this. I'm going to mark. I could use a full piece like this. I can fold the piece and then cut on the fold. Or if I do decide for whatever reason I want a seam allowance here, I could fold this back along that seam allowance, cut one side of the collar here, and then flip it over and cut the other side. Now, this particular shape just happens to be shaped so that I can just fold that under. With some shapes of collar, if you want that seam allowance, you would have to trim this off. But I like to give myself options because I don't know how I'm going to use this in the end. So I want to be able to decide later what I'm going to do. Now, just as with almost everything else in sewing, there are many schools of thought on interfacing. The most common interfacing that I use is actually fusible tricot. It's nice, it has a little bit of a stretch to it. You can use it for both wovens and knits, and it's not too heavy. It does come in more than one weight, but this is a pretty light one. And I like a lighter interfacing if I can get it. Now for Mandarin collars or stand-up collars, if you really want the collar to stay standing, sometimes it's best to interface both layers of the collar. Sometimes you might only want one if you want a softer look, but I'm going to do 2 today. And there's, again, schools of thought on this. You can do what's called block fusing, which is where you essentially cut kind of a rough cut of the shape and size of your collar, and then fuse that to the fabric before you cut it out. The advantages of that is it's a little less fiddly to cut out. You can be more confident of the accuracy of the shape of both the collar piece and the interfacing. And if your fabric is likely to shrink, it will do any shrinking it's going to do when you block fuse the interfacing versus if you cut out your collar piece from your fabric and then from your interfacing and then block and then fuse those two things together. If it shrinks at all, then your collar piece might be too small. For today's sample, I'm using a cotton fabric that's pretty stable. I'm not actually worried about shrinking, but I do want to save time, so I am going to block fuse. So the way I'm going to block fuse is, I do want 2 layers of interfacing. So here's I'm making sure that my edges lined up here. And then I'm just kind of looking to see roughly what size I'm going to need. And I forgot get my cutting tools. Seeing roughly what size I'm going to need here. That's about there. And then, just like it sounds, just kind of rough cutting. Not getting too anxious about being super accurate, but wanting to get this fairly rectangular piece here so that my grain line is matching. I can say, okay, it's definitely that far down, that far over. Then I'm going to give it 2 1/4 inches down, so then I'm going to go to 4 1/2 inches. I'll give it 5 inches, heck. Let's just be wild today. There we go. That's better. This is what I'm taking as like my good edge over here. Ready to go to the ironing board and fuse. All right, it's a new day, and I've got a new setup here with the camera, so hope you appreciate it. Now, I always fuse my interfacing as early in the process as possible, and I do that for a couple of reasons. If it kind of messes up, or if it turns out I have the wrong interfacing, I have more time than to kind of fix that before I get to that part of the pattern process or the garment making process. But then also, you always want to let fusibles sit as long as possible in between when you're fusing them and when you're sewing them, because then you're a lot less likely to have the fusing come undone. So first of all, for press cloths, you can actually see my handy press cloth storage under my ironing board, but when I'm doing a fusible interfacing, I don't use a regular press cloth, I use tissue paper. You can use white. I frankly save the tissue paper out of every package I ever get so that I've got everything I need, but it's cheap, and if I wreck it, I throw it away, so it's really easy. So I start out with a layer of tissue paper to protect my board, and then I lay down the fabric that I'm going to fuse. It's pretty little striped fabric today. And then here's my fusible, and what I need to do is I have to feel it to see which side has the glue. And the glue side will be a little rougher, and in this case, this is the rougher side, so I'm going to put that facing down. I'm going to line up my edges. And then sometimes I have a second layer of paper, sometimes I just fold the paper over if my pieces are small enough. And today they are. And then I have my iron set to wool, which is the setting I found works best for this interfacing. But you have to kind of test and see what works for you. But I'm going to start out right in the center of this interfacing with a nice bit of steam, and then I'm going to count for 10 seconds. Without moving the iron, and then I move it and do more steam. I should have put some more water in this, but you know, we do what we can. And basically you just repeat that procedure. Steam, wait, move. Steam, wait, move. And you do want to overlap where you're where you're putting your iron. As a last step, when I've done my fusing, is I just do a quick kind of tap all the way across the piece that I've fused with steam. And hopefully what that does is if the edge of your iron has left any impressions in your work as you fused, that would hopefully help smooth those out. And then if possible, you want to leave this absolutely still on the ironing board until it's totally cool. So go do something else. Have a cup of coffee, work on a different pattern, do something else, leave it to cool. All right, we're back at the cutting table. And a couple things. This is fused on, so that's kind of nice, and hopefully you can see that okay. But one of the nice things about stripes is you can use your full pattern piece to kind of look and line up with your grain line and your stripes to make sure that you're nice and square. But if you're like me and maybe you're a little paranoid about messing that up, you can also use just a little chalk mark. And I'm going to do that. I'm just going to lay a chalk mark down. And then I can use that to line up my grain line here. If I really want to make my life easy, I'll put it in the same position as the grain line. Just right there, ish. Always check to make sure your chalk mark will come out after you're done with it, but usually a pretty good bet. And there we go. And my usual pattern weights are too wide for this piece, so I'm going to use, actually these were the first pattern weights I ever bought. They're not at all fancy, they are from the hardware store. You buy them by weight, and they're very inexpensive, and I've never even bothered to make them pretty because they work just fine the way they are. And I'm ready to cut. Now, I want to get two colors out of this, so I'm going to try hard not to overcut into this area so that I can cut right up to that line for my second collar piece. Some people habitually are careful not to overcut. I'm not one of those people. I tend to cut through the line, not to the line. And I do like to leave my fabric still and move myself around the fabric when I'm cutting. Voila. Now, something you may have noticed that I did not transfer the shoulder mark from one side to the other, which is kind of a bummer. So, having noticed that, I'm just going to do that right now. Measure how far that is. There's my chalk. It's 3 1/8-ish. Somewhere like that. Another way to do this is actually easier if it's not too long. So with this guy, one closer. It's pretty good. Transfer that mark. There's my mark. And my chalk that just rolled off the table. And so then before I move this pattern piece for my second cut, I'm going to place those marks. And sometimes I just kind of lift it up and kind of cheat. Sometimes I even mark outside the piece and then basically transfer the mark from one side of the cut to the other. Works pretty well for me. If you're finicky, another way to do it is gently lift the pattern piece and mark that way, or you can mark using a pen. If I can find a pen. I don't use a lot of pins in my sewing, so I often struggle to find them when I want them. So you can also just put pins in your mark positions, and that's a mark. And sometimes this blade's a little getting close to needing to be replaced, so I'm just checking. Sometimes I have a little bit sign to snip. Now, you may have noticed if you're a little bit more experienced in sewing that I did not mention snipping these marks. Since this is only a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I don't snip for those marks because I feel like I don't have enough room to do that. But if you want to mark with snips, go right ahead. Now this one I'll show you what snips looks like if you've never done that. And when you mark with a snip, you do want to just make a really small snip. You don't want a huge whack of your fabric to be gone, especially with a 1/4 inch seam. And then if you mark with a pen, I kind of gestured at that but didn't do it. But if you want to, what you would do is you would sink your pen in there. And that stays until you're ready to sew. Looks pretty good. Sometimes there's just little spots where the blade just doesn't quite get through. And there are my 2 collar pieces. Finally ready to sew something. Now we've got both layers of the collar here. We're going to sew all along the curved edge. And if sewing that 1/4 inch seam makes you uncomfortable, there's no shame in marking that seam with a chalk marker or any other kind of marker. Just make sure the marks will come out before you start stitching. So I've just got my regular seam length here, stitch length here, and I'm going to stitch. Now, especially through the corners, again, slow will get you there, fast will sometimes get you the wrong place, so just take your time. Proper Minnesota fashion, I say, oh, I'm going to mess up. You could take this out a little bit and back it up. In this case, I'm just going to leave it, but that's why we sample. That's why we test. Should have gone a little slower through that area. And I'm actually using the hand wheel of the machine right now to advance literally as slowly as possible. And when it gets a little tough, I'm going to lift the foot, rotate. Again, slower is better in this case. All right, almost done. All right, been stitched. if your pattern uses a larger seam allowance, this is when you trim your seam allowance. This is already a 1/4 inch, so I kind of consider that pre-trimmed. But when you go to trim your seam allowance, if you do trim it, pay attention to which side you want to be the outside of the collar, because that is going to be the side you're going to trim a little bit longer. So you don't want the two sides to be exactly the same, because then it makes a really hard line against your outside. So just make sure that you're trimming in a way that works for you. Again, in this case I don't have to trim it, but I'll show you what that would look like if I did. You can trim each side one at a time. You can also turn your scissors a little bit. These are very small scissors for this, by the way, but if you turn your scissors a little bit, you can change the seam length or the width of the seam allowance as you cut. You see that? They're slightly different from each other. It doesn't have to be a huge difference, just as long as it's different. So there's that. And then one other thing you do need to do for a curve like this, you need to cut little wedges out of the curve, because otherwise it's very difficult to get a smooth result when you go to turn the seam. And again, people have different opinions about how much to trim and how much to clip and how aggressive to be about this, but you don't want to skip this step. Last 2 steps in this part of the process is turn and press, which sounds very easy, but can sometimes be a little hard to execute, but there are some tools that make it easier. Now this is a nice smooth curve, so you could argue that, okay, that means it's going to be pretty easy to turn out, and maybe it could. Maybe you could just turn it out with your fingers, but especially when you have a pointier collar, or if you don't get the best results with that, sometimes a tool is going to make your life a lot easier. So I'm going to start just by what happens if I do just flip it out with my hand. And I'm never really happy with how this looks, just kind of doing it with my fingers, because fingertips are they're small, but they're still pretty big. They're a lot bigger than this. So this is actually a tool designed for this. It's a point turner, and it's kind of got a pointy end, and it's got a less pointy end. You can use it for lots of things, but I'm going to start just by kind of jamming the non-pointy end into that curve. It gives me a nice curve. Another tool I use a lot is my hemostats. I use it for almost everything, but it's even nice for sometimes turning out collars. Really any seam that just needs a little push is going to get a great little push from your hemostat. Now here we can see the stitching because I used black thread, but look how nice that lace. Isn't it nice? So I use this all the time for just about every sewing I ever do. I have these on hand, so I love those. Another tool that some people really like is kind of a tailor's board or a pressing board, and in this case what you're looking for is great, especially for really pointy, sharp corners, to really be able to pull hard on it. But it also kind of helps with consistency. So in this case I would say, okay, that's probably the closest match. So I could possibly go on top of here. Actually, it's not quite exactly, it's actually not quite exactly the right curve, so maybe I'll use this one instead. There we go. And then I can press, or watch your hands, right on top of that wood board. That gives me a slightly different result. Next thing about this too is it has this big flat area. So if you don't have a separate tailor's clapper, you can actually use this as your clapper. What's a clapper for? Well, it helps things lay a lot flatter. It basically helps your press stay pressed. And one other thing is if you're pressing kind of a delicate fabric or even something where you're worried that the impression might come through, the main thing is you want to be a little careful. Don't just press, as hard and as wide as you can. First, start by just pressing as close to the edge as you're able. And this is actually, again, where the hemostat comes in really nice, is making sure that seam is really pushed out to the correct full shape. And just gently, again, we've only got a 1/4 inch seam here, so I don't have a lot of leeway to not hit that edge, but one color. For some very delicate fabrics, or especially for knit fabrics, I'll often just kind of steam over it and then hit it with a clapper. People have different opinions about how to use a clapper even. Sometimes they say you want to kind of tap it like I just did. Some people say put it on there and then leave it until you're pretty confident that it's cool, and then just keep doing that. What the clapper does is it basically, this wood draws the extra moisture and heat out of the fabric, so it kind of speeds up your cooling time. And that, pretty tidy little color.